Welcome to another edition of Hacker Heroes, a segment where we explore the stories behind the hackers in our community. Today we welcome Wendy Nather, a distinguished thought leader and cybersecurity strategist who has left an indelible mark on our community and is certainly not afraid to speak her mind. Stay tuned, my interview with Wendy Nather, coming up next. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Wendy Nather, welcome to Hacker Heroes.
Wow, thank you, Paul. It's amazing to be here.
So nice to have you, Wendy. When we were talking earlier, it's interesting. I was thinking about your background and what it must have been like to grow up, in the house you grew up in with technology, and your dad being kind of super technical. What was that like when you were growing up around technology?
Well, not only was he super technical, but he did everything without a license. So
True
he
hacker
got a
spirit.
BA. Exactly. He got a BA in English, and then he managed to get a job working as a nuclear physicist because, back then they didn't have courses.
Mm.
Um, he convinced a director to hire him. After that, he went on to invent a bunch of things. He wrote one of the first Fortran compilers. And then around the age of 40, he woke up one day and said, I think I'll become an astronomer now. And so he did that. And so there were all sorts of things that not only was I exposed to, but I had no idea that it was unusual.
Yeah, it was kind of the norm to have not just technology, but those technical discussions and access to computers early on.
Yep, yep. Acoustic coupler. Ooh, what's that? When you don't sneeze, it'll hang up. And things like that. So he taught me basic when I was 12 years old, and I was really bored. And he gave me a manual and said, "Go make the bell on the teletype ring," and that's where I started. So anytime I told him that I needed something to do, you never knew what he was going to give me.
Right, right. And did you spend time in, you said South Africa? Did you travel there or?
Yes, yes, we did. This was one of the cases where when my dad became an astronomer, he computerized uh, their observing equipment, and he was teaching a lot of classes. He basically created the field of high-speed photoelectric photometry. And
Mm.
then when they wanted to make him a professor, they realized that he only had a BA in English and he had no degrees in anything else. So we went off to South Africa for a year where he spent a year of residency at the University of Cape Town, wrote his dissertation, got the PhD. We came right back. That was like the quickest and dirtiest PhD I've ever seen.
And you lived in Austin, right?
That's right. That's right. We were living in Austin at the time. So we went to South Africa, came back to Austin.
And I feel like Texas has always been kind of a hub for things in technology and certainly security too. It's early computing days, but it wasn't always in Austin, right? There was some in Dallas. It's been kind of the like not unspoken, but not as well recognized technology hub.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you had AMD and 3M and IBM really, really early on, but you had like EDS in Dallas and all sorts of high tech up there. And then when Dell got started, and I'd like to point out that Michael Dell dropped out of UT just as I did, except he did a lot better with his dropping out. When that
Debatable,
started building.
debatable.
Yeah. Well, he's got a better house than I do. I can say that for sure. But then all sorts of companies started moving in, and when you got IBM and Dell and HP and Apple and now the Facebooks, the Googles, everything, people are really flooding in. So and Tesla, mustn't forget Tesla.
Hmm. Tesla's a relatively new addition, though, to
Very
Texas.
new. Yep,
Mm,
yep.
that's interesting. And so you did go to college, but you didn't finish college?
That's right. I was in liberal arts, in the liberal arts honors program. And at the same time, I was also formatting people's papers for them using my dad's astronomy department, PDP 11. I was doing NROF and TROF, and I was making money on the side doing that.
Hmm,
And after a while, I just decided that I would rather do the jobs and make money and rather than continue working on my degree. So I dropped out.
and did you learn like systems administration and things like that? Was that your some of your early?
I did later on, after I fell in with a bunch of ARPANET hackers, and this was in the mid 80s. I started moving around to wherever I was, being offered a job. And so I went from being a lowly typist, not even a secretary, but a typist, using all the TROF macros that there
Mhm.
were, to becoming a technical writer and then doing some technical support. And from there, I became a system administrator.
I gotcha. I do want to talk about said early days of ARPANET. Was that the you mentioned the Bandikin list? And it's interesting because there
Mhm.
I study a lot of hacker history, right? And there's like phone phreaking, and then a lot of attacks on the phone system computers, and then there's kind of like a gap where everyone just starts talking about the Morris worm. Like I feel like there's gaps in conversations that we've had in a lot of works on hacking that kind of leaves out the this particular time frame, I think.
Yeah, and part of that is because um, if you think of hacking in a very narrow definition of just having to do with security, you're
Mm,
going to miss a lot of stuff. If you read the book Hackers by Stephen Levy, that
mhm,
talks a lot about what some of those folks were doing in MIT back
mhm,
at that time. And there were other people who weren't mentioned, but who were working on internals for BSD at Berkeley, who were working on networking, people at Apple, people at BBN,
mhm.
and Xerox Park and everything. And so, I hung out with them. And the thing is, they didn't become notorious because they weren't breaking stuff,
They were building
but
stuff.
they were,
I mean, yeah,
yeah, they
BBM
were
built.
building stuff, but they were also, doing shenanigans that were not necessarily breaking into systems or not in the sort of way where it became a trend enough for anybody to write about.
It's interesting. Tell me about this mailing list.
Bandykin started when Andrew Beals, who went by Bandy, his girlfriend broke up with him on Valentine's Day, which was really rude and very
Yeah.
sad. And so a bunch of people wanted to create a mailing list to help console him. And it just started collecting all sorts of interesting people on all the coasts, people at Rutgers, MIT, Berkeley, Purdue,
What was
and
this?
everything in between.
What time frame we talking about? I don't want to date you. You're gonna
Around
show your age, but
83, 84,
okay.
something like that. Yeah. So I fell in with them when I was hanging out on Usenet, and one day I got an email that said, "Hi, we like you. Would you like to become a Bandykin?" Like literally it said
Right.
that.
And you were like, what is
And
that?
and and I joined that mailing list. RMS, Stallman was on there too. Uh, lots of people you might have heard of, but this was a very social mailing list. And if you Google it, you will still see that it's described as one of the more notorious social mailing lists of that time.
That was before the times of social media and Twitter and Facebook, where really our social interaction were Usenet chat rooms, but also email was
Right.
huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Email mailing lists were the big thing where you could control who you added to it.
Mm. Right. You Usenet mailing. No, what was the mailing list technology that I used? Now I can't think of it. There was a lot of where you create a mailing list. I administered one.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember now too.
Listserv. Probably
Yeah.
probably after 83 when listserv was more popular, but it was probably a similar technology, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was. Yeah, I know it was run off of one of the MIT servers,
Mhm.
MIT Oz, I think.
Yes. I worked in university space. I'm familiar with some of the tech and infamous servers at MIT. Um, eh,
Yes.
but this just wasn't. You weren't just. You got together in person as well as basically. It was kind of like a club. No, sounded like.
It was, we would somebody would host a get together over a weekend. in their house, and everybody would show up, and there would be lots of food and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and hacking, of course,
Mm.
and just about anything you can imagine. And we would also meet up at science fiction conferences too. That was the other thing. Uh, more social than going to a Usenix conference or anything like that. We'd go to the social things.
Yeah. What when you say hacking, what was hacking like when you got together, right? Because there wasn't a lot of computer security as we term it today in 1983.
No, things were really, real. And again, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with breaking into systems.
Mm.
First of all, things were, really open. You could RMS into any account of his, that was still open with the name username RMS and password RMS. That
Mhm.
became a verb. Yeah, I RMS'd over here, to get this file. But a lot of us were system administrators. We would give each other accounts. So I had an account on MIT Eddy.
Mhm.
I had an account at Apple. I don't remember why. Somebody else in Finland later on gave me an account on their Russian PDP-11 clone. You just collected accounts everywhere. You didn't have to break into things, and it
Right.
was
Yeah,
more
'cause we
to
didn't.
Yeah,
socialize
and we didn't
and
have
talk.
computers like we could go to the store and buy easily
Yeah.
in 1983. I mean, we did, but it wasn't like today where you've got the cloud and you can spin up virtual computers. Really, the way you get access to computers was talking to your friends on a mailing list, for example, and they'd create an account for you. So you had an account.
Yeah, and we just play around. Like for example, when there was one that had anonymous FTP turned on, and the convention was always if you logged in to anonymous FTP, you'd put your username as the password or your
Mm.
email address so that the admins would know who it was. That was just the polite thing to do. But I knew the sysadmin and knew he was reading the log, so I would send him messages in the password field.
Mhm.
Hey, how's it going? And, do you want pizza? That sort of thing. So there was all sorts of things that we were playing around that wouldn't be considered crimes or anything even today. It's just those were playgrounds.
Right. Is that where you learned lockpicking?
No, I learned lockpicking much later, thanks to wonderful B-sides, lockpick villages and
Gotcha.
everything. I think pretty sure that's where I picked it up.
And so you said sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I don't know how literal that is, but you've got some stories around that. Tell the t-shirt story. I love the t-shirt story.
Yeah, the t-shirt story. So, we were always pranking each other. Um, at one of these conference, get-togethers at somebody's house, where they made a lot of soup. We called it SoupCon. Um, there was a young man, I won't say his name here, who was part of, because he's grown up now like the rest of us.
Mhm.
um, there was, and everybody should, receive forgiveness for, everything we did that was stupid in the 80s. But
Not just
apparently,
maybe not just the 80s, but okay.
yeah, yeah, starting in the 80s. He was very young, really wanted to lose his virginity. And he had heard that there were orgies at these get-togethers, and he figured that would be a good way to, get his wish. So he came to one of these weekend
Wait, Were there were
shindigs.
were there actually orgies, or is that just like a legend, or you don't want to say?
Well, that was the legend. That was the legend. And he on Saturday night he went up to the host and hostess's bedroom and waited there all evening, waiting for people to come upstairs and start taking off their clothes. And that didn't happen. And so the next morning, with tears
Oh
in
wait,
his eyes,
he sat there all night in the bedroom by himself.
that's how the story goes. He sat there,
That's some persistence.
all evening,
Patient.
waiting, yeah, waiting for it to happen. Didn't happen. He went home disappointed, but some people heard that that's what he did and that's why. And so after he left, we decided to have t-shirts made to pretend that we just waited to have the orgy until he left. But we named it after him. And we made t-shirts that said, "I survived the first name last name memorial orgy." And so we all got these t-shirts, and at the next conference, I think that was a sci-fi con where he was going to be, we all wore the t-shirts. So if you can
But
imagine us
people are
all
reading
showing
the
up.
right, but people reading the T-shirt didn't realize that it was a memorial for an orgy that happened after he left, which is
Yeah, or
part of the
it
joke.
was a
Yeah,
memorial for him,
right, right.
like he was gone or dead or something, and we held the orgy in his memory. Which that I thought that was just the icing on the cake. So you can imagine his response, when he came and saw everybody wearing this T-shirt. And so we gave him his own, of course, because you have to have a copy of this
Mm.
T-shirt if it's named after you. And I don't know if this is true, but the legend continues that apparently he wore that T-shirt to high school one day, and there were some girls that were so impressed that he had an orgy named after him that he ended up getting his wish after all.
That
The
is
end.
a great story. Social engineering at its finest, right? Sometimes all it takes is getting a T-shirt made up.
And I still have that T-shirt, and a couple of my other friends still have that T-shirt. I don't think we fit into them anymore, but yeah, that's a piece of memorabilia I'm always going to hang on to. My kids found it one time and went,
Yeah.
"Mom."
What is this?
Yeah, they were scared and disgusted all at the same time.
We've accumulated some interesting T-shirts as hackers over the. Do you save all of your T-shirts? Because like all the conferences I've been to, I come home. At least used to come home. We went to conferences with at least 3 or 4 additional T-shirts, and I
Hmm.
think our spouses kind of get aggravated that the T-shirts take up so much room, and some you don't want to part with.
Yeah, I mean, my husband has a ton of them, and the cool ones end up circulating throughout the family.
Yeah,
So my kids run off with the coolest ones right away. So I never know where those are, except we always have at least one load of pure black T-shirts to
and they're
do
always
every
black.
week.
I mean, for the
Yeah,
most part, they're
yeah,
black T-shirts. Yeah.
that's
I've
right.
certainly gotten some cool ones. My kids have too. Sometimes they don't know the significance. I'm like, you realize if you're
Yeah.
wearing a DerbyCon T-shirt, like you should be the cool kid at school, except everyone you go to school with probably has no idea what DerbyCon was, and you have a limited edition DerbyCon T-shirt.
That's right. I started putting some of them away in an archive because I said,
Hmm.
no, nobody can wear these anymore. I don't want them wearing out anymore because they really are one of a kind.
What are some of your favorite? I mean, other than the Bandican soup, do you call them soup cons? Because you made soup when you went there. Is that what
Well, that was one type of get together because that particular host and hostess made soup. But
gotcha?
yeah, just we would just get together for all sorts of reasons.
I mean, that's really how security conferences started. Was just a bunch of people on a mailing list or BBS or whatever got together.
Yeah, and just met up for fun, and then thought, hey, why don't we work on this project together?
Right.
You could be, at anything for any reason. Hobbit was on, Alan Walker was on the mailing list too,
Hobbit's the
and
creator of Netcat.
yes, yes. And he was going around barefoot back then too, even in the snows in Boston during BosCon. He would walk around with flip-flops in his back pocket just in case we were going into a restaurant for dinner where he needed to put on,
Is that
some
with people that
shoes.
wanted to walk around barefoot? I mean, I respect their decision, but like I worked with someone at Brown University who was always barefoot in the office. Like, didn't matter what time of year, and this was in the office. I
Yeah,
don't know about outside the office, but they're like always barefoot. I was like, okay, that's a choice.
that is a choice. And whenever we went to hotels or whatever, they would go what we called vatting. That was kind of from the text-based game on Unix systems called ADV, Adventure, kind of spelled sideways. So we called it vatting. And
Hmm.
people would go explore not just the tunnels, under MIT, but they would explore, throughout the hotels. One time, I think they tried to find the bottom of the hotel swimming pool so they could bang on it with a hammer. They would
Uh,
go and break into the linen closets to get people um, extra pillows and sheets and stuff like that. I remember Hobbit once starting to take apart from the inside the rental car that we were driving on a road trip one time, and I was like, Hobbit, cut that out.
there's something to the extraordinary level of curiosity that I think we
Hmm.
have as hackers. Is that like pretty much a constant in many of the people we know in this industry?
I think so. That not just curiosity and creativity.
Yes.
So, for example, my favorite hacker movie is not what you would think. It's actually Real Genius
Val,
because
Val Kilmer, right?
Val Kilmer and those folks, those were so many of those people were just like people that I knew. And in fact, one of them, that the character of Jordan, the girl, the really hyper girl, was patterned off of a woman who was on the Bandican mailing list.
Oh,
And
interesting.
they interviewed her and based the character off of her. And she was not only a hardware engineer, but she also spun uh, her own yarn for knitting. She managed to knit a shawl that was so fine that you could pass it through a wedding band.
Hmm.
And she would just do these things, for fun.
Right.
So there was so much creativity, not just, banging on stuff.
Yeah, I feel like hackers have this like never-ending stream of hypotheses that you have to test. Like, can I
Mhm.
create something so fun I can put a wedding ring over it? Like, would be one, and we
Yeah.
go off and do that. Do you have a lot of hobbies or projects that you've worked on in that vein, Wendy?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I got my fill with doing all sorts of weird things with those folks, like creating oobleck, cornstarch and water, which is a non-Newtonian fluid, where if you hit it, it becomes rigid, but if you let it flow, it flows like liquid. I remember they made a bunch of oobleck in one hotel tub and then whacked it so hard that it actually broke the tub out of its settings. So, once
We're
you
always
see a lot
testing
of that
stuff,
stuff,
right? Testing the integrity of the tub, right?
yeah, or not really testing, but not so explicitly, but let's just see what happens. And
Yes.
somebody will haul off and wang it and go, "Did you have to do that? Now we got to pay for this."
Yeah.
So
What
I
happens
got a
if?
lot of that out of
What
my
happens
system.
if is a question that we as hackers ask all the time, right? When we're
Yeah,
breaking into systems, when we're building stuff, like what happens if? I love that
yeah,
about the kind of hacker spirit and culture.
exactly. Yeah. Or, type this. What if I type something really stupid? What
Yeah.
if I connect this to this? Um, what if? Yeah.
What if I put a JNDI URL in the login screen? That kind of stuff. Then we
Can
have the log4j.
Yeah, can I get two grapes to race each other in the microwave? Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of that at security conferences. What are some of your favorite security conferences that you've been to? I know I've seen you at quite a few.
hmm hmm there are just so many, and the thing that I love is that there's so many tribes in
Yeah.
security, and so you can go to all these different conferences and meet different groups of people with different perspectives on things. Um, I, have really enjoyed ShmooCon and um, uh, DEF CON, Black Hat. I enjoy RSA too. I'm really
Hmm.
involved with that. You wouldn't call it a hacker conference, but there's
Many
a
of us
lot of
show up.
really interesting stuff.
Yeah, because many of us have day jobs now and we show up to RSA.
Yeah, sometimes because we have to, and sometimes because, we're working on things that require a lot of coordination, and that's the best place to find people in government, for example, who are, and you want to get them in front of somebody to hear for them to hear, what's really happening.
And
So
sometimes it's just about zombie brains.
yeah, yeah, it is about zombie brains, or uh,
Someone said you were holding zombie brains at a conference. That
oh, that was at RSA. That
oh,
that
you
that
tell.
was we when Josh Corman and Alex Hutton were doing a talk, and we arranged with them that because um, they were comparing security preparedness to the zombie apocalypse. And so several of us dressed up as zombies, and in mid talk, we came staggering in and came onto the stage and went, brains. And we had made some brains out of jello and started eating them. And that's still on YouTube. You can find that. I think that's the first time that that a stunt like that was pulled at an RSA in the middle of an RSA talk.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, what were speaking of jobs, right? What were some of your first jobs how did you get into security and actually work in the cybersecurity industry?
Well, I was working for a proprietary options trading firm, O'Connor and Associates in Chicago, and they were acquired by Swiss Bank Corporation, which is now part of UBS. And since I had been in liberal arts and had concentrated in foreign languages, I spoke French and German and Unix. So I volunteered to move to Switzerland to work with their first Unix admin team, and we spent 3 years migrating all of the traders and staff and everybody out to new buildings out near Zurich Airport. So I did that for 3 years, and then they decided to outsource their IT operations to Perot Systems.
Hmm.
And I was put um, on a task force to figure out whether we could safely outsource IT operations to them without violating Swiss banking law. And that's how I kind of slipped into the security thing. And at that point, they moved me to London and put me in charge of security for the EMEA region. And that's how I found myself in there with no instructions or anything, just
Right.
making it up.
I think there's this perception, Wendy, that when we think of the persona of a hacker, that you always have to be super technical no matter what. And I want to make sure we address that because that, as you and I both know, that's not the case.
Not at all. And if you really think about it, kids, when they are very, very young, when they start arguing with you, they are
Hmm.
doing exactly what we learned to do in programming, like how to be very explicit. If they can find a loophole in what you told them, like, I want you to pick up your room, I want everything off the floor, and they will just pick up everything and put it on the bed and go,
Oh my
well,
god, my
you didn't
teenager
say
does
I had
that.
to put it away.
My teenager
Yeah,
does that with me today. I'm like, you need to make sure there's nothing on the floor. He's like, so what do you want me to do? Pick up my bed and my desk and stuff because that's on the
yeah.
floor. I'm like, oh my god, I'm raising a version of myself that now is retribution for all that trouble I gave my parents.
Exactly. And that is, they already have that hacker mindset from
Mm,
the time that a toddler's going, I wonder what happens if I do this. And
yes.
you're like, you did what to the dog?
Hmm.
Um, it, that's where it starts. So no, you do not have to be technical. You just need to have that mindset. You need to be encouraged to follow up with it, and you can do hacking in any area, bioengineering, um, I don't know, you name it. There are all sorts of things where you can go, I wonder what happens if I do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when we think about who is a hacker. I think people that really understand hacker culture will be like Alexander Graham Bell and these other examples that aren't, some of the technical folks, no disrespect to them, right? But aren't the typical answer, right?
That's right. They're not the person in the hoodie, even though we're in the hoodie.
Hmm.
Um, we've gotten so narrowly focused, and I blame, the media for that
Yeah.
because that's what they tend to focus on, and also, movies and everything that are just stereotyping hackers. Again, that's why I think Real Genius is so cool because you see people who are doing all sorts of creative things all the time that have nothing to do with breaking into systems or
I have
even
to go
even
back and watch
necessarily
that.
programming.
I watched that. It's been many years since I've watched that movie, but I'll have to go back to that one.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, half of those people are almost exactly like people I knew back then. So I feel like I'm going home whenever I go to watch that. And people are makers now. You have to celebrate the maker culture, the art culture, um, all sorts of people who are, even if you think about it, lawyers are really good at hacking legislation
Hacking
because
the
one thing
system.
you have to do is look at what do you think they call it? Code.
Hmm.
Texas Administrative Code, you look at it and go, well, we really need to do this, but word for word, it says we can't do this, but if we did this and went around this, could we do the right thing anyway? And when you're writing legislation today, you have to think really hard about abuse cases. How could somebody misuse this? How could this be combined in a bad way with some other existing laws on the books? It it's the same principle.
Absolutely. And then you where it trips me up is international law, and how does that play into the case? And I think in hacker history, certainly when we portray that or communicate that here in the U.S., we oftentimes miss the kind of international aspect of that. We think of the cuckoo's egg and Clifford Stall, and we often don't get the entire story behind the hackers that were in Germany and in over in Europe that are a huge part of that story, right?
They absolutely are. I mean, IRC, was created by Jarkko Oikarinen, and
Was it Finnish? Was
back
he
in
Finnish? Finnish?
Finnish. Yeah, he was at the University of Oulu,
Mm.
and um, when I started on there, that was like a year or two after it got going. There were only about a couple hundred people on it, and most of those were in
Wait, you were
Europe.
on IRC where you're saying there was only a couple of hundred people on IRC.
That's right.
That is astonishing. And and that's how you met your husband?
That is how I met my husband, in a channel called Hot Tub, which was mostly German hackers. And luckily I knew German, so, I'd
There
be
you go.
talking with them.
That's awesome.
And
That was a lot of the
yeah,
IRC chat rooms though, because it wasn't like when you see a chat room named Hot Tub, your mind may go to like dirty thoughts, but oftentimes it wasn't really about that. I mean, sometimes it was, but there was all these like really neat kind of chat room names in IRC.
there were, and once in a while you get somebody who would go ASL at you, or hey baby. But
Right, right.
most of the time it wasn't like that. It was just, very social people hanging out, people from Finland, Germany, gosh,
That was, I mean, that was
I'm trying to
the
remember.
progression from like mailing list to maybe Usenet, and I think it pretty much chat was IRC. Like the first chat was
Well,
IRC.
FidoNet predated it, and gosh, what was the other one that Yako patterned it after?
Uh,
BitNet Relay.
Bitnet Relay. Yes, yes.
Yeah,
That
yeah. And so, and we had get-togethers back then too, except we called them IRC relay parties because there's still that echo of BitNet Relay where
mm,
we would get together, and that's where I met my husband, was at a party in Munich. Um, but, we already knew each other online, but we met
yeah.
face to face at
So wait,
at a
you were in
party.
IRC chat room and you're having to get together and you flew to Germany?
I flew to Germany because I was on my way on business to Singapore to
Okay.
teach a sysadmin course for a couple of weeks. And so I went one way around through Germany, met him, and
Hmm.
then went to Tokyo to take a backup of a server that I was going to go clone in Singapore. So I was
Hmm.
only in Tokyo for like 30 hours and then flew down to Singapore to clone that server and teach the classes.
Wow, that's amazing. How do we encourage people to get into our field today? I think it's amazing to kind of delve into your history, Wendy, and some of the history of the internet and various communication mechanisms that obviously looks very different today. What's kind of some of your advice on, folks that want to break in? We've already established that you don't have to be a technical wizard, right? We need different roles in security. We need technical wizards, but other roles as well.
We really do. And in fact, when I was at Swiss Bank and they promoted me to director, I got an administrative assistant because that's what you got with the
What you got?
position.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
automatic. Somebody hired one and sent her along to me. I didn't have any choice in who it was.
Hmm.
And after I worked with her a bit, I thought, she's really smart. I don't need a PA.
Hmm.
So I put her in charge of my access control group. And today, 25 years later,
Hmm.
she is in charge of the regional CISOs at Standard Chartered Bank.
It's awesome.
So,
Yeah.
she learned everything else that she needed to learn in the meantime. And I think we need to be bringing people in like that
Mm.
and say, you're really clever at figuring out how to do things. Would you like to come figure out how to do this with us? Because let's be honest, we are all still learning as fast as we can all the time. It's
Mhm.
not like you had to have 20 years of experience and you needed to remember all of that. Nobody cares what you did with Windows NT anymore. That's not relevant. So I think we need to find really good learners and bring them in and just in all sorts of areas.
I think you're right. We put up so many barriers. If someone's resume doesn't look a certain way, doesn't have a certain experience, we immediately put the barriers up. And it's all about identifying the talent and the attitude.
Hmm.
is really what I
Hmm.
what I come down to. And it sounds like you did that with the person who was working for you, right? She had the
Right.
right attitude and aptitude. I love the word clever too. That's
Hmm.
definitely part of the hacker, hacker ethos is, there's a cleverness about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I love seeing somebody pull something clever, even if I have to go, oh, that's really cool. And then, oh, crap. Now I got to tell somebody about this.
Yeah, there's an ethics component to what we do as well, which is
Hmm.
really interesting. Have you had to disclose things, over your career? I mean, being in some of the early days in some of these channels, I'm sure you've had stuff where you're like, someone should tell someone about that, right?
Oh, for sure. When I helped to stand up the retail and hospitality ISAC, I would get threat intel all the time that I had to try to get to some retailer, even if they weren't a member of the ISAC. I'd have to try
Mhm.
to reach out to them and say, I need to talk with your with your security people. And a lot of times they wouldn't trust me. They'd say, we don't want to buy anything. I'd have to go through LinkedIn to get friends of friends of friends to go
Mhm.
call the CISO and say, no, really, you need to talk to her. There was one case where there was an internal threat who was selling access to the point of sale systems.
Mhm.
So I couldn't just email them or fill out a form because I had no idea where the insider was. So I had to go out of band and use the social network to get a hold of the CISO. Then I explained to him what was going on, and we figured out the best way for me to send him the data was for him to go pick one of their company's fax machines at random, go stand in front of it, and I would fax him the data because we figured the chances were pretty low that there wasn't anybody monitoring, old-fashioned fax phone lines.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk
So
fax machines.
that's the sort of thing that you have to figure out how to do, and it can apply to just about anything, whether it's hacking. Your doctor wants to give you a certain treatment, but insurance won't cover it, so they try to figure out a way to code it so they will.
Mm,
um, we got to encourage more of that.
agreed. Yeah, do you think that the disclosure has gotten better, that whole process? I feel like it has, just, having done disclosure myself, and many of the mutual friends, right, have been in that
Yeah.
disclosure situation. Do you think it's gotten better? I mean, the loft, I think, is kind of the one of the examples as a point in time when disclosure was pretty bad, right? I feel like we've gotten much better over time.
I think it has gotten better to those who do it professionally
Yeah.
now, but I think we still have a big gaping hole in that there is no good, secure way of doing ad hoc communication with somebody who's not expecting to hear from you.
Yeah.
You gotta get a hold of, if you want to get a hold of somebody at 7-Eleven headquarters, you have no idea how to do it. They don't necessarily have a security at email address, and there's no way to authenticate yourself and say, no, really, I'm from CISA, I'm from the government, I'm trying to give you some important information, but I can't tell you what it is until, we've established secure comms. I
Yeah.
think that whole ad hoc communications problem is still out there. So we need to bring more people in, not just the bug bounty folks, not just the professional researchers. We got to reach way outside the security industry and make it a part of everybody's, operations.
Because I still think there's those circumstances when you're a stranger popping out of the blue calling someone's baby's ugly, right?
Hmm.
That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, or yeah, it's um, either calling their babies ugly or saying, I'm dependent on you. You're part of my supply chain. Can you please fix this? And if you're a big company like Cisco, chances are they will agree to do it. But if you're a smaller company, they'll be like, well, you're the only person who's complained about this. We're not fixing
Right.
this.
Right. How
Um,
did you end up at Cisco? I think for our audience.
well, I asked Doug Song at Duo whether he had any room for me at Duo, and it turns out he did. So I joined them, and then Duo was acquired by Cisco in 2018.
And you were pre-acquisition.
That's right, I was pre-acquisition.
What attracts you to do? I mean, Doug is just I've met, interviewed Doug once, and like I feel like he's like a close friend of mine. Really, he's just such a
Yeah.
likable person, extremely smart, and just his perspectives on things. I can see what attracted you to go work for Duo just based on Doug, right?
Well, yeah, Doug helped, and this is when I was an analyst at 451 Research, when I was running the practice there.
Mhm,
Anytime one of my team members left, I had to, cover their area. So for a while, I was covering identity and access management.
mhm.
And it's probably the same thing with you, Paul. After so many decades of seeing user interfaces,
Yeah.
you've seen thousands of them, most of them really bad. I looked the at the push screen for Duo and said, "Oh my God, this is so good." And so I was immediately impressed. And then when I would be briefed by Doug and John Oberheide,
Mhm.
I really liked their vision. And so it turned out later on when they opened up an Austin office, that's when I went to them and said, can I join you? It looks like you're doing pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was always one to pick on user interfaces, as it sounds like you were too, Wendy. And it turns out there's not many good ones because they're super hard to build a really
Hmm.
good user, not just interface, but experience. And I think that's
Right.
more of what you're speaking to, right? Is that experience for the user.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, at Duo, when I joined, we had something like 5 engineers to every one design person.
Hmm.
And that's almost unheard of as a ratio. We
Right.
had so many designers focusing on it because often that makes the difference between adoption and not. And let's face it, security is not going to work if people are working around it or not adopting it.
Should people know that there's security in the products that they're using? How do we balance that usability with security?
I think might have been Josh Corman who said that security should be translucent, in
Mm.
that you should not have to notice it, but if you want to reassure yourself that it's there, you should be able to easily assure yourself. So I think it's a combination of that. But more importantly, I think that along with encouraging people to think, like an adventurous hacker, no matter what they're doing, I think we should be encouraging them to make their own security decisions. And you can start that as soon as your kids are young.
Mhm.
For example, my husband and I have never used parental controls. And sometimes it would result in, a kid coming to me and going, "Oh, mom." And I go,
I
"Yeah,
saw
that's a
this
pretty
really
gross
stupid
YouTube
thing on the
video,
internet,
isn't it?"
right? And you're like, "There's
Yeah.
stupid things on the internet, like, don't explore those anymore," right?
Yeah. It's like, now you know. Yeah, that's really gross. I suggest you not do that anymore.
Mm.
But one time, my teenager came to me and she said, "Can you help me set the parental controls on my phone?" And I'm like, "Honey, why?" And it's because she wanted help setting up her own structure and discipline for her study time so she wouldn't be distracted by social media apps. And I said, "Okay, you set it up the way you want it to with all the times and the hours and the apps, and then I'll put a password on it so that you can't, change it.
Mhm.
And then anytime you want to change it again, you come to me and, we'll do whatever you want." And the thing is, she set it up for her purposes, not for mine. And I think that's what we should be teaching our kids, raising them not only to break things, but to make things and to make secure decisions that serve them.
I mean, needless to say, you've raised your children very well, Wendy, right? To now have them have the wisdom to go, "I wanna put some controls because I gotta manage my time," basically, right? And focus on the right things and not the distractions.
Yeah, it works for them. I also taught both of them of my kids to pick locks, and they were
Mhm.
both annoyed that I taught the other kid. And I said, "Well, this way it's mutually assured destruction."
It's a level playing field. I feel
Hmm.
like that it's across, children and parents, right? Because 'Cause we're in a household where all of us know how to lockpick. And I think that what that teaches you is that you have to have a mutual respect for each other
Yes.
and each other's privacy. And I think that's a great lesson to teach everyone is not, and I think this really speaks to security awareness and training, right? It's not the stick, it's the mutual respect and understanding that there's boundaries and guidelines, but those aren't necessarily going to be enforced by some technical control or analog control like a lock.
That's right. And I don't want my kids to not learn about security until they grow up, get a job, and their employer tells them, here's your device and here's how you're allowed to use it and here's how you're not allowed to use it. I
Mm.
think that's, that authoritarian model is going by the wayside because we're all consumers of technology now. But it's, yeah, it's very important to be able to let them, encourage them to make those decisions in a relationship of, as you said, mutual respect and trust, so that even though, my kids were upset when they were young because my husband and I know too much about technology and we're not supposed to because we're the wrong generation.
Mm.
And I said, honey, who do you think built the internet?
Right.
This is not your technology. This is our technology. But it's all about, it shouldn't be adversarial. It should be collaborative.
I feel like there's a lot of things wrong with security awareness and training today. And I was reading a study that, was proving the point that when you send phishing emails that are simulated and then follow that up immediately with some type of security awareness training, that's actually detrimental to the security of the organization. I feel like you fall in this camp, Wendy, of going, we need to think about security
Yeah.
awareness differently.
I totally do, um, because what we've been trying with that for decades is just not working,
Yeah. The
and
stick doesn't it doesn't work.
it doesn't work, and we have to ask ourselves why. And it's not just a matter of training louder and training
Mhm.
harder. The question is, should we even have to train them? Should they know? Or should we be designing security better so it doesn't matter? So they
Mhm.
don't have to be, PhDs in what not to click on. Maybe that was a silly idea of ours to begin with. And also, I tried in one of my CISO jobs, we did an experiment with phishing where we had done like 25 different security awareness courses, and they were completely voluntary. And people would show up to them because, they liked the way we delivered the information. So we knew who was attending the courses, and we decided to do a phishing exercise. And we would see if the people who went to the awareness classes were less likely to click on the link. Turns out we found it was the opposite.
Hmm.
The ones who did not attend the classes were less likely to click on the link. We're like, what? 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 What even? And the only thing that I can think of is that the people who came to the awareness classes really loved security. They wanted to be part of the team, they wanted to help. And the phishing email that we sent was one of those, here, click here to test the strength of your password. Thank you for helping us.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I
Yeah, it looks
figured
like
that they
security
were
awareness
just like,
gone wrong.
yes, I want to do this. I want to help be secure.
Mm, that's interesting.
So yeah, you don't want to do this. So what we do at Duo and part of Cisco is that we want to incentivize certain behaviors.
Mhm.
And one of the behaviors we want to incentivize is telling us when they see a phishing email. So if they do that, especially if they fell for it, but if they tell us about it, we celebrate the hell out of them,
Mhm.
because that's the behavior we want to incentivize, not the being embarrassed because you clicked, hiding it from the security people. That's counterproductive.
It is, and I think so many organizations get this wrong in terms of generating awareness and the wrong incentives, right? What you're saying is
Mhm.
positive reinforcement is the way to go.
Yes, that's exactly it. You said it better than I did.
Well, I get that from my kids too, because I think you see the, at least with most people, right? Positive reinforcement works better than taking away their iPads, right? The
hmm
reward system
hmm
works much
It
better.
is social engineering a higher level,
Mm.
definitely a higher level.
It's interesting though how part of the awareness is giving people some insights into the hacker mindset. Is that a thing that like we understand how hackers work and we want our employees to kind of be part of that mindset as well because in the end that protects us better?
Yes, and it is, I don't think we should be teaching them the hacker mindset so that they can outthink the attacker. I think that's really unfair. But for them to understand that this is how somebody thinks, and you probably think that way too when you're trying to get around a security control you don't like.
Yeah.
Teaching them that
Yeah.
way, that will encourage them to go, if, I'm building this right now, how would I abuse it? And it's really interesting. I don't know if you saw an interview a long time ago that Tripwire did with Damon Cortese, where he talked about um, writing his own application, and he found that he had to do all the coding first, get it functional, and then go back and look at it with his security researcher hat on separately. And he found all sorts of flaws that he made in it that he usually warns people not to do. And so I believe from this that we cannot hold those two states in our head at the same time. You can't make something work while figuring out how to abuse it at the same time. Um, and I think that's an important thing that we have to build into our development processes.
That's really interesting. I find myself going down the same paths when I write software that I can't, my brain physically can't think about all the ways someone would abuse it. Like I got to get it built and working first and then
Yes.
transition. You're absolutely right. That's the thing.
And if you can't do it, how would we expect somebody who's not versed in security to be able to do that? So, as a CISO, I would always get the question, well, yeah, okay, I see you could do that to this, but who would want to do that?
Mm.
The question I always got was, who would want to do that? And I would have to explain, threat modeling and say, no, there really are people out there who are doing this right now, even to similar applications. And then they'll go, well, all right, I still don't think it's going to happen, but okay.
Mm.
So there's a difference between making them think like attackers and just getting them to understand why we do what we do.
Is awareness around resiliency something we can build into certainly software developers? I know Josh Corman, certainly, who's a mutual friend, right, talks a lot about that resiliency aspect. Is that one of the things we should be keying in on with developers specifically?
Oh, sure. Resilience has become such a big thing now, especially since the pandemic, and especially with supply chain attacks
Mhm.
and the ripple effects of those attacks. Um, Resilience has come back to the forefront of everybody's attention. So I think, um, and also everybody has experienced um, those sorts of outages and failures, so they know they can happen. They believe in them. They don't necessarily believe in the probability of somebody trying to steal their data or other things. But if you talk about, we really don't want this to go down, um, I think everybody will buy into that. So definitely working from a resilience angle, and then after that, migrating further to, well, what if somebody does this by mistake?
Yeah.
Because other people, unfortunately, still believe in the stupid user. So they'll go, okay, yeah, I can believe somebody might accidentally do this. I guess we better protect against that. Then the step after that is, what if somebody maliciously does that? And by the time you've, coded to take care of resilience and accidental misuse, you're most of the way there to protecting against abuse cases, I think. But tell me what you think.
I agree because when I was, when I write software, I think there's two different kinds of software development, right? There's the ones that many of us hackers and pen testers and defenders, I need to create a piece of software, a script that serves a purpose for me. And that's one aspect. When I started developing an application that other people use, I had to start like change my mindset to go, I got to code really defensively. Like I got to defend every possible scenario because I learned through experience that users are going to do things that I didn't anticipate or expect. And I had to
Hmm.
basically not threat model for security, but threat model for users and really do a
Yeah.
lot more error checking and things like that in my code. And that ended up reducing the number of tickets that were created after the code was pushed. And I do think you're right. I think that brings us right up to security, or at least delves into some of the early security aspects of software that we create.
Yeah, and I'll tell you another funny story about my dad. He used to code everything in his head.
Mm.
He would just sit there in his armchair at home for a long time thinking, then he'd go sit at the computer and write it all in.
Yeah.
And the stuff that he wrote for the astronomy department, every once in a while, an astronomer during an observing run would call him and say, this thing is acting weird, this software. And he'd, listen to what they described. He'd go sit down, he'd run through the program in his head and go, I know what the problem is. And he'd go sit down and fix it. Now, you can't do that anymore with the types
No,
of code that we
that's an
write.
extraordinary skill. I think, when I
Yeah,
coach new interns and developers, I tell them to write all the comments out, like write stuff down, right?
yeah.
Like what you want to in comments before you start writing code. To be able to do
Hmm.
that in your head is truly astonishing. It's amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing back then. But yeah, it's true. It is very different when you're writing something for your own purposes and you know what they are and you know this is how I'm going to use it and I know I'm not going to try this.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it all goes up in the air when you let anybody else touch it.
And that's how we end up with a lot of vulnerabilities. Not just Log4j, but so many vulnerabilities is that unexpected use case.
Yeah, yeah, it's we shouldn't let anybody use our code. I think that's the way to
Right.
protect it.
If we were the only user, we'd be totally fine. We'd work within our own
Right.
parameters, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh boy. Um, well, one of the other, I know we're running a little short on time, but one of the questions that I think we tackle on a regular basis is like, what is basic security hygiene? Like, is it a myth? Is it something that's different for every company? How do we get to like, what is the basics of security?
Oh boy. I mean, just because it's basic doesn't mean it's easy or it's simple, because if it were, we'd be doing it by now.
Right.
Um, I think it's some of the hardest things um, to accomplish in security. And part of it is sometimes I do a little pyramid, which is um, at the bottom is just knowing what you have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's you never know how hard that is and still until you actually start trying to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're trying to um, inventory all your hardware, you're trying to inventory your software, then you're trying to determine, does this count as ours or not? It affects us, but we outsource this to somebody else. Should we say it's theirs? Is it ours? Um, I have a friend who is at a Texas state agency, and he loves to read documentation. And he one day he was sitting down and reading some old contracts, and he discovered that that agency had 2 acres of data center that they didn't even know they had
2 acres.
because
This is a lot.
2 acres. It was listed in this third party contract. Apparently, a third party was running the systems for them. It was part of, an extremely large application. I'm sure they would have noticed if it had gone down.
Mm-hmm.
But, the address of the data center was there in the contract. And just for fun, he got in the car and drove over there. And sure enough, 12 or 15,000 servers
Oh my God.
that they didn't know they had. So this happens all the time. Um, if we could figure out a way to solve that problem, we'd be able to move to the next levels, which are being able to control changes to it, either to stop changes to it or to accelerate changes to it. But that's what we call hygiene, and I don't think people appreciate how hard it is because CISOs are not going to get up on stage and say, "Yeah, this is really hard. We're not good at that." Nobody's going to do that.
And I think there's differences between asset discovery and asset management, right? And
Hmm.
it's in your story, it's the discovery that was the first step that is oftentimes can be as difficult as the management side of it.
That's right, because it was being managed by
Mm.
contract, and who knows how they were managing it? Was it based on some run book, that was years old? Um, they didn't know that they should scan it. They might not have been able to scan it. A lot, and that's the other problem that we've run into with the pandemic. When everybody went home, you couldn't scan everybody's endpoints anymore because ISPs see that as an attack and they block it. So how are you going to check the state of your endpoints, even assuming that what they're using really is an endpoint that you gave them, and that's not always a given.
Certainly not the case, for sure. It's one of the, I think when we talk about basic security and basic hygiene, one of the things we identify is something you should do, but could oftentimes be the most difficult. And we talk to our pen tester friends, and they're like, how did you get in? It's almost often something, some asset, some application, some account, something that someone didn't know about or had forgotten about, or the person that set that up had left, right? How many times have we
Yeah.
seen that when we hear stories from our pen tester friends?
Or it was supposed to be ephemeral.
Yes.
If you look at the story of the Colorado Department of Transportation's bout with ransomware, it started when somebody spun up a VM that was supposed to be just, very temporary. And so they didn't bother, they put an admin password on it, but they didn't configure it
Mhm.
any better way. Within a couple of days, the password was brute forced, and because it was set up according to a template, it was already joined to the domain. So the attacker was able
Yep.
to elevate privileges, go in there and drop the ransomware. So it was a case of something that was being put together by reflex, just automatically, putting in the trust, but it wasn't supposed to be there very long, so they didn't finish
Yep.
doing what they should have done.
I did that recently. My
Oops.
vulnerable log4j container, I was like, oh wait, that's still running on my system. I gotta shut that down. I left it running. It's so easy to spin up infrastructure and services and systems today that's it makes it more challenging.
Yeah, so don't yell at these folks. I'm asking you, pen testers, don't
Yeah,
yell at them. They're trying the best they can, and I would bet if you went and sat in their seat, you'd see just how difficult it is.
absolutely. Wendy, what are you working on today? What is your role at Duo today?
Well, actually, I'm part of the greater Cisco
Hmm.
collective now in the Cisco's security group. I'm in the strategy office, and I'm reporting to Doug Song. He's in charge of the strategy office. So we are working on security strategy across all of Cisco's security products, and that's really exciting and uh, really complex,
Yeah,
but
that's a
it's
lot.
fascinating.
That's a lot of moving parts right there. Sassy comes into the mix in that.
It sure does.
Great
Yeah.
Sassy offering, actually.
SASE, zero trust,
Hmm.
um, pick a buzzword, XDR, and figuring out what that means to
Yeah.
Cisco and what that means to everybody else, and um, um, how do we explain these things, because the buzzwords are getting less and less obvious. At least I find it that way.
I agree. XDR is one that is the most recent one that's difficult to unpack and understand what it means to you.
Yeah. What does it mean to you, Paul?
I think it's that combination of what we called endpoint security and log management and or SIM, right? But I think I kind of drew these, I call them magic sectors, right? I don't want to infringe on any patents when we talk about the keyword, right? But you've got your endpoint telemetry, network telemetry, your log telemetry, and maybe some threat intelligence, and that fills up my four quadrants, if you will. And I really think bringing all those things together in uh, a platform that gives you visibility and the ability to detect attacks is really, I think, where they tried to get XDR to represent, but it's confusing to people.
It is, and the way you describe it, I'm like, well, haven't we been trying to do that all this time? Why,
Yeah,
why,
yeah,
why is it called XDR now? I think the way I understand it from Ali Mellon at Forrester is that the difference now is that you also want to pull in information from non-security systems to enrich what you're making decisions on. Like if it has to do with the user, you kind of want to know whether they just had their Active Directory account disabled.
right, right.
So pulling that information, or pulling I don't know, smart card badge information, pulling all sorts of things from non-security systems to help you do that detection and response is where the X comes in. But that's how I understand it. But I'm sure there are tons of vendors who will say, no, our solution is XDR.
Well, we always have that. There's a lot of
Yeah,
vendors out there. That could be a whole different podcast, Wendy.
it could. It really
You'll have to
would.
come on Enterprise Security Weekly, and we'll talk shop on the vendor side.
Oh, God.
Wendy, it's been so wonderful having you here on Hacker Heroes. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Paul. It's great fun, and I hope that we get to sit down and have a drink or two in the future.
I can't wait. Have a drink or 12, maybe.
Yeah.
Things get out of hand. It's all in good fun. Wendy, thank you so much.
All right. Take care.